if a government is able to deliver really dramatic improvements in people's social and economic conditions and does it with a more authoritarian, less democratic method of government, how do you get your head around that? Most dramatically of all, China is the situation where 700 million people were lifted out of extreme poverty. There's been this most incredible economic growth without there being a democracy. And it's a really raw nerve where I think those of us that believe in liberal democracy need to make a much, much clearer, better case. Welcome to the Rest is Politics question time. Here's a question on the Maldives from Kerry. Can you please discuss the recent election in the Maldives and what it might mean for their relationship with China? Quick explainer before I come to you on the election. So Maldives, tiny place, 500,000 people, and a massive kind of Cold War between India and China, where quite literally the Chinese will build some enormous bridge called the China-Maldives Bridge, and then India will build an even more enormous bridge called the India-Maldives Bridge. And it's become vital because China sees this island as being a great refueling point and strategic base in the sea. And of course, India, who's much closer to Maldives, also sees it as vital for its maritime security. The country is basically an island that makes most of its money off tourism. I mean, like 95% of its money off tourism. Lovely place, I think, to go on holiday. Not that I've never actually been there. Have you been there? Been to Maldives?
No.
Anyway, maybe we should go to Maldives.
Special Rest is Politics in the Maldives. Right.
That's right. Important to follow up. Anyway, so this and China, of course, tends to spend more money than India, has poured in more money, but because India's closer, it's able to put more ratcheting on security. And this has translated into political parties in the Maldives basically being very nakedly either pro-China or pro-India. And my understanding is the pro-Chinese party in the Maldives just won a landslide. Is that right?
They have. Essentially, this is a big win for Beijing. So the president, Mohamed Muitsu, absolute landslide. They won 70 out of 93 seats, which means they've got massive control. And as you say, it was pretty much, there are obviously lots of different domestic issues, but the opposition party, the MDP, led by an ex-president, a guy called Ibrahim Mohammed Solih, who we've talked about before, he is seen as very, very pro-India, and he won 15 seats against 65. So that is all a big, big yes, thumbs up to the president's plan to plough ahead with much, much closer cooperation with China. And, you know, that is quite a big deal.
And I think just a reminder of something we sometimes talk about. I mean, so the Chinese economy is obviously in big, big trouble. It's going to struggle to grow, huge problems around the property market, huge problems around aging. But it would be a real mistake to conclude from that China's international power is really waning. In fact, what we can see with these kinds of things and in many other places around the world, that China is still the second largest economy in the world, the largest exporter in the world, the largest manufacturer in the world. And even if it's getting older and its economy isn't growing so fast, it continues to increase its power dramatically in many, many parts of the world. I mean, we've seen that, you know, it still remains very strong in Africa, and I would argue has actually strengthened its position against the US and Africa over the last 4 years. So there's a lot going on here, as you can imagine, in the States, of everybody trying to talk about how China's economy is weak. But it reminds me a little bit of people saying, you know, this was something Obama did, saying Russia's economy was so weak and it was getting so old in 2014 that it wasn't really a threat to the world. This idea that there's a direct connection between your economic growth and your demography and whether or not you're a major security player, I think is a mistake. I think China is actually, even as its economy struggles to grow, I think it's flexing its international muscles more and more.
And there is a security element to this as well, as there was in the recent election in the Solomon Islands. And the government has actually asked, there are many, many Indian military personnel who are there, and they operate Indian Renaissance aircraft to essentially patrolling the country's borders. And the president has asked them to leave. Now, where are they going to get that security from in the future? Well, maybe they'll go to China.
Yeah.
So these things are, you know, we may think of a small country that's rightly obsessed about climate change because that's such a sort of existential threat. But all of these smaller countries now tend to be caught up in these bigger geostrategic struggles. By the way, just briefly on Modi, Rory, I don't know if you saw it. I sent you a thing about an Australian journalist, television journalist, who's been essentially kicked out of India because they don't
Yeah.
like the reporting.
I suddenly got just a very, very thin glimpse into Modi's cyber warriors when I was critical about Modi on the rest of his politics with you a
Yeah,
couple of weeks ago.
yeah,
It is impressive or slightly worrying what
both.
an incredible social media army he has to
Yeah,
attack anyone who dares to criticize.
absolutely. I suspect that means that that Sadiq Khan will be getting the same treatment because, of course, he was quite critical, wasn't he, when we interviewed him on Leading the
Yeah,
other day?
yeah. That'll be interesting for him. You were in Singapore, and here's a question about Singapore from somebody called Martin. Both of you have waxed lyrical in your praise of Singapore's approach to government. It would be nice to hear alongside this praise the acknowledgement that it's a pseudo-democracy that's been ruled by a single family for almost its entire existence. How do you balance your praise for Singapore with its notorious intolerance of dissent that would be viewed as routine in any actual democracy? I don't think he means routine. Maybe something outrageous in any actual
Yeah.
democracy.
The first point about the family. So Lee Kuan Yew, the original founder, it is true that his son is the current prime minister who is stepping down. But you'd be very hard pressed to find anybody, including well beyond Singapore, who doesn't think that Lee Kuan Yew is an extraordinary leader and who built this incredible success story. And likewise, anybody who's ever met the son, Lee Hsien Loong, who is about to go, he's one of the cleverest political leaders I've ever met. So I don't think you could say he's only there because he is the son. And likewise, there have been other prime ministers in between, and there's going to be another one starting soon, Lawrence Wong. And I think that sometimes I can see why, from a purely Western perspective, you can say, well, they have pretty easy time with the media. They're a pretty government that's a very, very strong government and so forth. But it's certainly not. It is a democracy in that there are opposition parties who are in parliament, who have freedom to campaign and do campaign. And Rory, can I briefly read you a letter? I told you recently that one of my favourite ministers out there, a guy called, he's called Shan by everybody, but he's the Minister of Law, K. Shanmugam.
Was
And
he the guy that kindly was reading my book?
he was reading your book and he told you how he was sending pictures of pages of your book to colleagues in the civil service and in the ministries and in the government to say, this is, he loved the book. And anyway, the reason I wanted to draw him to your attention again is because The Economist did an editorial recently about Singapore that was very much on the lines of our questioner, very, very, questioning a lot about Singapore's success and standards, etc. So let me just read you Shan's Facebook post. The Economist cannot resist sneering. It's an instinct lodged deep in the unconscious of the British commentariat class. They cannot stand that a people they were accustomed to lecturing are now doing better than they are across the board. Take governance. Lawrence Wong will be our fourth Prime Minister in 59 years. Meanwhile, in the UK, Mr. Rishi Sunak is their fourth Prime Minister in 4.9 years. Mr. Boris Johnson, when he was Prime Minister, accepted a holiday worth £15,000 and £50,000 for renovations from donors. In Singapore, anyone who did that would have been charged in court. Or the economy. We started as a British colony with per capita GDP of $500 Now it's more than 80,000. We have the fifth highest GDP per capita in the world, well ahead of the UK. On our media, The Economist refers to our docile press. It obviously prefers a situation like in the UK, where one person can control major media outlets and have politicians pay court to him, and where media owners can influence who gets elected and who becomes Prime Minister. A similar situation in Australia was described by a former Prime Minister as a cancer on democracy. And he goes on and on and on, and finally says, in social cohesion, in the UK, a Tory party donor recently said of a black MP that looking at her makes him want to hate all black women. His party said, all should just move on from the comments, that's it. In Singapore, a person who made such a comment would be charged in court. What price your sneer? Pretty good.
There we are. There we are. Now let me. I mean, I think to balance this, we should
Yes.
put we should link to the Economist article,
Yeah.
which makes clearly the other case on this. But
Yeah.
it's an interesting thing. I mean, I'm obviously I'm speaking to you from Yale, where I'm teaching at the moment, and I've got a Rwandan student here who makes similar arguments for Rwanda, which has had a very, very impressive economic development story since the 90s, along with an authoritarian government. And it's a real question, I mean, repeated again and again through the developing world, which is, if a government is able to deliver really dramatic improvements in people's social and economic conditions and does it with a more authoritarian, less democratic method of government, how do you get your head around that? Because we were brought up to believe that there was an easy going together, no choices to be made, that liberal democracy and economic growth were natural partners.
Yeah.
But of course, most dramatically of all, China is a situation where 700 million people were lifted out of extreme poverty. There's been this most incredible economic growth without there being a democracy. And I think this is one of the issues when you look at opinion polls in the Middle East, and in Africa, people increasingly will say that they prefer the Singaporean system or the system in Dubai, for example, which is another
Yeah.
authoritarian state, to Britain, France, the United States. So it's a really raw nerve where I think those of us that believe in liberal democracy need to make a much, much clearer, better case.
We've talked before, and I've written about John Major's speech that he made a while back, in democracy we trust, question mark. And he basically says there is an arrogance to the democracies that we assume that we're just better. And the point about the feeling I always get when I'm in Singapore, when I go to Singapore, is when you talk to people, the politicians, they are very, very, very conscious in a way that I think a lot of our politicians are not, of delivery. In other words, they feel if they have to be delivering according to the priorities that they've set out, they have to be delivering good public services, they have to be delivering on the economy and so forth. And they are very, very, very conscious of the arguments that are pushed their way by the opposition. So I think sometimes these sort of, and also if you do have to look at where they are in the world. Very, very different place to where we are, and so I think it's easy, as Sean says, it is easy to sneer, and it is easy to make the case that they're not necessarily. They don't necessarily run in the same way that our democracy does. But at the same time, I think in terms of where they've come from to where they've got to as a democracy, it's a very, very impressive story.
There are many, many impressive things about it. And listen, I mean, there are serious constraints on the media and serious constraints on other political parties, but one of their biggest achievements was on corruption. I mean, it's made it very, very powerful example in a region where there is endemic corruption, that Singapore basically managed to eliminate corruption almost entirely. I mean, it's less corrupt than Britain. Here's a little nerdy question from Kieran Ward that I liked, because sometimes people want us to talk about the nerdy details of politics. Does the House of Commons have a seating plan? I often see my MP, Chris Elmore, standing by the Speaker and many other MPs squeezed like sardines on the benches. I know the front bench obviously sits in an order, but not sure how it works in the rows behind. Actually, the truth is, there's absolutely no seating plan. So, and the benches are deliberately designed to not be able to hold all the MPs, because when it was bombed during the war, there was an idea of going back to a system of actually having enough room for everybody. And Churchill said, no, he really liked the sense, the hubbub. So I spent a lot of my early years sitting on the stairs, not actually on a chair. And even when you're a cabinet minister, there's no seating plan. I mean, broadly speaking, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor get to sit in the middle, the more senior ministers. But
I think you're overlooking the Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Oliver Dowden. I think the Deputy Prime Minister might get there as
Prime
well.
Minister, I'm always overlooking the Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Oliver Dowden. But otherwise, you come in and you squeeze in, and a lot of it, of course, is so your constituents can see you on telly. So there was a lot of push. You'll notice often behind the Prime Minister or behind the Leader of the Opposition will be the sort of rising stars of the party that people want to get on television and show. And in the early days of the Cameron government, it was often, I guess, it was an opportunity for Cameron to show diversity in the new intake with the people that he would sit behind him, and they would be captured on the media.
I used to get very angry if ever there was a shot of the front bench, say whether it was Tony Blair or a minister at the front bench, if the Commons was busy and there were no women or people of colour behind. I think that was something we thought of. But there is a sort of informal placement. Um, I know that, for example, across so you've got where you've got the dispatch box, and then the Dennis Skinner, who's an absolute veteran, used to always have the same
The
place, and every
beast
other
of
MP.
Bolsover.
Absolutely. Every other MP, if they were sitting there, knew that if he came in, they would move up. Likewise, I think Ted Heath had a place when he was on the back benches that I think Theresa May has now. I think I noticed that she always sits in the same place. And I wonder if she's already established that if she comes into the Commons and somebody's sitting there, they shuffle up a bit. But no, there's no plasma.
That's right. Very, very, very senior people. And the father of the house often had a kind of set
Yeah.
position. But no, you're right. I mean, apart from these kind of few kind of legendary big figures, the rest of us largely kind of
Squeeze in where you can.
shuffling. Although we try to, I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg made a sort of system right from the moment he arrived has this incredible kind of lounging where he's almost lying on the bench, and he used to sit right at the end of the chamber, kind of sort of drag himself, unfold himself onto his feet. And then you've got the whips who often stand behind the speaker's chair so they can't be seen from the television cameras.
Yeah.
Trying to sort of whip up people into these kind of football chants. So you can see them kind of conducting from the back of the speaker's chair, trying to get people to shout, "Hear, hear."
Yeah. Now, here's one from Sal, which has been the issue has been angering me for days. Why on earth would Labour dismiss out of hand Europe's offer to talk about free movement for 80 to 30-year-olds for 4 years? Sal goes on, I'm thinking of ending my membership and voting Lib Dem because of this, though I know it will be a wasted vote in my constituency. It's so infuriating. I guess the straight answer to the question, why on earth would Labour dismiss it out of hand, is because they don't want anything which allows the Tories to make a big deal about Labour trying to shift their position on Europe, because that will then allow them to, as it were, reopen the Brexit debate. I agree with Sal. I think that to dismiss it out of hand at a time when there is so many difficulties arriving from the government's Brexit deal that have to be fixed, I found very, very depressing.
Well, it's heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking. I mean, and it's such a good proposal, and it's such a defensible proposal, and it hits a particular group of people in a really useful way. I guess the only thing presumably Keir Starmer might have been a bit annoyed with the timing. I mean, he presumably would have liked Europe to have consulted a bit more closely on when they announced this and how they made this offer.
I don't know. I don't know is the answer to that. But it slightly worries me that, okay, look, at some point there is going to have to be some kind of pivot towards a position that says Brexit is not working. It's damaging us economically. Our number one mission is growth. We're going to have to address some of these issues. But I also think when we talk about, I hear so many, sorry to plug my books again, but one of the reasons I'm writing them is because I hear so many young people saying they don't feel that the political parties understand them, care about them, get their issues and so forth. I think the Tories go on. I mean, that ridiculous David Frost had a piece the other day saying, we've got to stop a Labour government, otherwise there's a risk of them undoing our greatest achievement, which was Brexit. I mean, if you're honestly saying Brexit was your greatest achievement, the point is that it's got to be addressed at some point. We're going into the election with this as a massive elephant in the room.
One thing that I think we need to do more of, people like you and me who want a much closer relationship with Europe and would like Labour to announce they're rejoining the customs union immediately, etc., is to use some of the Brexiteers' words against them. Jacob Rees-Mogg's been out there saying, essentially, the problem is that Brexit wasn't done right. But what he really means by that needs to be made clear, which is that they had a fantasy that once they left the European Union, they would go for this incredible kind of low tax, deregulated
Singapore on Thames.
Yeah, Singapore on Thames stuff. And of course, what has turned out to be the case is there's no support for that in Britain. I mean, people, broadly speaking, have a pretty socially democratic vision of their country. They want to continue to support the NHS. They're trying to, essentially support the kind of British values that have underlain the British state since the 40s. And so, and the other thing is that they were betting, the Brexiteers were betting on a much closer relationship with China. They kept saying, China's growing much more quickly than Europe. But of course, the whole security situation has changed since then. And now the whole push is to de-risk and decouple from places like China and to be closer to your nearest allies because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So the whole world's changed since Brexit. I
Mm.
mean, somehow we're going to have to land that.
Yeah, I can honestly say that there is nothing that is going to stop me vote Labour in the next election. Okay, I am going to vote Labour in the next election, but I know quite a lot of people who are instinctively pro-Labour, who, unless there is some sort of signal on some of these issues on which Labour are quiet, particularly Brexit and Europe, but also issues like the voting system, the political system, and so forth. I think they're taking quite a lot of people for granted.
Yeah, that's the problem, isn't it? That's the problem that the voters will feel that Labour thinks, oh well, kind of progressive liberals are going to vote for us anyway, so we don't have to do any policies for
Mm.
them.
Now, there is a question here. So there's me being very negative about Labour.
Yeah.
One that will give me the opportunity to be a little bit more positive. Jenny, have the private railways failed passengers? Over the weekend, it was revealed that performance targets for train operators have seemingly been lowered in order to reward companies despite record cancellations and falling standards. Bosses and shareholders are taking home millions from the taxpayer. Is this waste of money acceptable? Now, we're recording this on Tuesday, and I think it's on Thursday that Louise Haigh, who's the Shadow Transport Secretary, is setting out what sounds to me like quite an exciting thing, because I think we are going to get the promise of a new Railways Act in the first King's speech, and at the heart, publicly owned, accountable, arm's length Great British Railways. Now, I don't know any more than that. I just know that. But I think actually I do think that our railways, every time I'm on a railway and a train, whether it's in Italy, it's in Germany, or it's France, or it's Scandinavia, they are just so much better than ours and cheaper.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think if Labour have got a thought through plan to get a grip of our railways, the devil will be in the detail. But I'm very, very glad that it looks like it's going to be slammed right into the centre of the agenda.
I was quite proud of our piece that we did in our recent podcast on Canada. And I was talking to a Canadian politician who said the way in which Canada's a bit like Britain is that it's a country that is really struggling to get its productivity sorted out, really
Mm,
struggling. It's sort of underperforming compared to
yeah,
places like the US, and really beginning to worry about how it's going to fund public services, because without the growth and productivity, it's never getting the tax revenue to really keep going things that Canadians care deeply about, like their health service, etc. And
yeah,
and that's, I think, that the challenge, isn't it, for countries like Canada and Britain? Why are we underperforming? How do you turn this around? Because if you don't manage to turn it around, we're facing a horrible situation.
mm,
Because you're right, trains are a disgrace, but so's health,
yeah,
huge problems in education, prisons, and we just keep going, right?
yeah,
And that's going to be the really big, interesting challenge for
mm,
Labour.
mm,
Are they going to
mm.
be able to deal with this?
On the health thing, I had a meeting yesterday at a well, I'll name it. It was the Royal Free, my local hospital, but the charity that is attached, and a lot of the big hospitals now, a lot of the small hospitals as well, there are these charities attached to them, and it was fascinating to talk to them about the extent to which the fundraising that they're involved in is helping to deliver really, really significant healthcare projects that you and I and most people probably think are just being paid for by the state. So you're absolutely right. These are all services that are going to face massive challenges. One of the other things I understand in this new Labour transport plan, which I think will be welcomed by people like Sadiq and Andy Burnham and the other elected mayors, is that they are going to give much more, give a bigger role within the rail network to the leaders of the devolved authorities as well. So all I know is what I've said to you, but I think it sounds quite an interesting move, and I think will be, hopefully will be another sort of flagship policy that Labour will be able to say makes them different to the Tories. I've got one here, Rory. I've got
Yeah,
one for
go on.
you.
I've asked a lot. Yeah.
Patsy Heller. I very much enjoyed the leading interview with Sadiq Khan, but I was disappointed by Rory's summary, which felt more negative than the interview himself. Surely he is not voting for Susan Hall. I think we should be told. Now, come on, Rory, you can't just keep sitting on fences. Your bum will get sore.
Gosh, it's really depressing. I mean, look, I ran against Sadiq Khan, so I obviously think there are problems with him as mayor, and it would be a bit hypocritical and peculiar for me to do that. But I've been trying to work out.
Wait a minute.
But I'm trying to work out who I would vote for in that election. So I got excited for a moment by the Green candidate. I mean, we're getting through our doors in London at the moment, all this literature from different people.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, maybe the Green candidate's the way to go. And then I read the Green candidates thing, and it was such sort of boring, bland, unconvincing stuff.
So the Greens are out. Is Susan Hall out? Is she out of your reckoning?
I think it's unlikely I will vote for Susan Hall. Yeah, but I'd be interested to see what people think, because I think, look, it's a difficult thing to say, because I'm very, very, I can see a lot to like about Sadiq Khan, but I don't think he's the world's greatest mayor, and I'm just a bit disappointed by the whole bunch of the candidates.
But you can't, Rory. You can't, as a sort of somebody who's committed to politics as a vital part of our national life, you can't not vote.
No. Well, that's why I was looking at the Green. Anyway, don't.
And also, but it is in the end, because of this ridiculous new voting system, which you and I both think they shouldn't have allowed.
Yeah.
And which, in the end, it is up to the choice is Sadiq or Susan.
He loves this phrase. It's a 2-horse race. He doesn't want people like me looking at people like the Greens.
So which horse are you backing? You got to back a horse, Rory. Patsy wants you to back a horse.
Go on. Here's my final thing, Stephen.
Go on.
Should anyone above the age of 70 be allowed to vote? Alastair, you're a great one for young people voting. What do you think about old people voting?
I am a great one for young people, but when I'll be 70 in 3 years' time, so I hope I'll vote. I think there's a case for weighted voting. There definitely was a case for weighted voting in the Brexit referendum.
Oh, my
Should
Lord.
have had 3 votes for 16 to 30, 2 votes for 30 to 60, and 1 vote for above 60. That would have been a great voting system.
I'm going to make a boring principled objection to that, which is democracy is based on the absolute equality of every individual and everybody having the same weight.
Yeah, but Rory would have been unprecedented times. All
right. Okay, Alastair, thank you very much.
All the best.
Bye-bye. Thanks again. Bye.